Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Homefront and Paradise Lost, which are episodes 10 and 11 of Season 4 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So this video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. This episode was the winner of the Patreon poll that I ran exclusively for my Patreon supporters, where I selected 5 episodes that I wanted to review, and the episode that my Patreon supporters selected was this two-parter, Homefront and Paradise Lost. So, Homefront and Paradise Lost covers the story of a terrorist attack on Earth from the Changeling. So Cisco and Odo return to Earth in order to help in the defenses against the Changeling, in which Cisco is reunited with his former commander, Admiral Latent, and they try to convince the president of the United Federation of Planets to beef up security. And eventually, when another attack happens where there's a huge power outage, the president finally relents to them, but then Cisco soon discovers that the power outage attack was actually orchestrated by Admiral Latent, and that he plans to overthrow the president of the Federation in order to take over. So basically a military coup. So Cisco and Odo work to stop him. So So this has always been one of my favorite episodes, personally. I really like this two-parter, although I didn't quite like it as much at first, but it's really interesting. So let me get into some of the production news or issues with this episode. It's kind of interesting because this is kind of similar to my favorite Voyager two-parter, Year of Hell, in the sense that this was originally supposed to be the Season 3 finale of Deep Space Nine, and then the Season 4 opener. But because Year of Hell was originally, that was supposed to be the Season 3 finale of Voyager and the Season 4 opener, but they realized that they would rather do this Borg storyline, so they scrapped it, but then they just pushed it back and did it later in the season, sort of had to repurpose it for them to fit into that new season. And that's exactly what happened here with Deep Space Nine, because the studio pushed them to do something new and fresh with Season 4 because they were losing ratings, so they came up with this whole Klingon storyline. So since they had the Klingon storyline, they scrapped this idea and pushed it back. Now, apparently, originally, the first part, Homefront, was supposed to be a Season 3 finale, rather than The Adversary, but the studio said they didn't want the season to end on a cliffhanger, so they scrapped it and came up with something a bit more open-ended rather than a right-on cliffhanger. Now, it's very interesting because I always thought it was weird how Deep Space Nine's finales tend to just be open-ended, kind of leaving you open-ended, but not a true cliffhanger, because that was a tradition with Next Generation, starting with Best of Both Worlds, which is such a success that every year after the season would end on the cliffhanger of part 1, and then this premiere of the next season would be part 2 that resolves it. And Voyager actually, for the most part, continued this tradition as well. So I'm not sure why the producers of Deep Space Nine, the head of the studio, apparently, it wasn't Iron or Stephen Bear or anyone like that. Apparently it was the Paramount execs were very much against this, which I don't understand. Why is it okay for Next Gen and Voyager to do it, but not okay for Deep Space Nine to do it? I don't know if I understand that. Plus, me and my brother had a long-running joke about how Deep Space Nine would end its seasons with Odo saying something shocking. Although they only did this twice. It was Season 3 and Season 4, but really that's 2 years in a row. Instead of having a proper cliffhanger, they end the season with Odo saying something shocking. But anyway, for whatever reason, I don't really understand, they decided to push this back. So it's interesting, because when I originally heard this, I thought this was supposed to be the follow-up to the adversary. So I thought season 3 would end in the adversary, and season 4 would open with this two-parter or a storyline similar to it. But apparently not. Apparently this is supposed to replace the adversary, which I don't know. Maybe it would have been different, but I think you need the adversary first to set up the threat of the changelings, and then, because that's why, part of the reason why I think this two-parter works is because the threat of changeling infiltration is already established. So if you just go cold into this two-parter without establishing that threat first, I don't think it works quite as well. I thought that was part of the appeal. And it did seem to me that the adversary was setting season 4 up to be all about this changeling infiltration, and then season 4 went a different direction with making about the Klingons. Now I know you could draw and some people will excuse this and draw a loose comparison from the Klingon storyline to the changeling infiltration, because the reason why there were hostilities between the Federation and Klingon was due to the changeling infiltration, but it's not really explored until season 5. And even then, it's kind of a haphazard excuse, in my opinion, by the writers to shoehorn a Klingon storyline into season 4. And if you've seen any of my videos or reviews on season 4, you know I was not a fan of making the Klingons an enemy again. But anyway, not that relevant to this two-parter. Because this two-parter thankfully doesn't really touch on that at all. Now, another thing that's interesting to note, and especially in the second part, Paradise Lost, this is very evident from that title, that this Iron Stephen Bear, who took over as the showrunner of Deep Space Nine in season 3, really didn't agree with Roddenberry's vision of a perfect utopian society future. And he constantly, and I think Ronald D. Moore and other writers also, took issue with this, and so I think it shows more in Deep Space Nine than it does in other modern shows. Although I would argue that even Voyager and Enterprise depart a lot from Roddenberry's vision. I'd even go as far as to say season 6 and 7 of Next Generation, after Roddenberry passed, as soon as he passed, they pretty much made it much more militaristic than Roddenberry would have been comfortable with. And bearing in mind that Roddenberry hated Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, and he wanted the movie scrapped. So it was almost a bit ironic that they had a title saying for Gene Roddenberry. If you know about how much he hated that movie, it's kind of takes on a different meaning, because he passed away, of course, before the movie actually was released in theaters. But so anyway, Ira Stephen Bear hated Roddenberry's vision of a perfect future, and he constantly he wouldn't outright attack it, of course, because that wouldn't work, but he tried to chip away at it. And this is another example of it, and here's another thing that Roddenberry said, that he never wanted to see Earth, although they did show Earth briefly in Star Trek The Motion Picture. But for the most part, he said he wanted to avoid seeing Earth, that wasn't really what it was about. It was about, the Starfleet going out into space. But I think it had more to do with he wouldn't know how to properly portray what Earth was like. And so in this two-parter, we do get Earth. And, so the whole point of especially the second part was to show how it's not really paradise. And there's been hints dropped throughout Deep Space Nine's run that the paradise isn't as perfect as I would say Roddenberry wants it to think it is, and that there's things that could destroy it or chip it away, which is a bit more realistic to life that we know. I personally, even though I'm a huge Deep Space Nine fan, I consider it my favorite Star Trek show, I am still a huge fan of Roddenberry's vision. So I would actually probably side with Roddenberry more than Iron Stephen Bear, and I think that he's looking at it from more of a modern perspective, and letting modern day society interfere with a vision of what could possibly be in a totally different culture. But that being said, I do agree that Roddenberry would often take his vision too far, as particularly in Next Gen, where he would say, there's no conflict between anyone in the 21st century, but you can't have good storytelling. And that's probably why that left a bad taste in Iron Stephen Bear's mouth, and so why he constantly tried to chip away at it. But anyway, another interesting thing I read is apparently after these episodes aired or were made, Iron Stephen Bear, for the rest of the run of Deep Space Nine, had a note on his office that read, "Remember Paradise Lost." And what I was referring to was apparently running out of budget. Because apparently, in his opinion, this episode wasn't very good, or wasn't nearly as good as it could have been, because they ran out of budget. Because this was aired sort of a bit later in season 4. One of the other writers, what's-his-face, Wolf, talked about how, I don't even know what the sweeps are, but apparently back in the 90s, there were like prime areas to show certain episodes that you wanted to be big and get across. And this apparently was aired in like a dead time, so not in that prime time of the year where you want to showcase your good episodes. And so they thought it was the worst time to show it. But also, they used up all their budget on the Way of the Warrior, and so they barely had any budget left for this episode, and so a lot of things had to be cut. Like Iron Stephen Bear talked about how he regretted that they didn't show more Starfleet. When they had the scene where Starfleet took over Earth, you just see, where they basically enacted martial law, where they put Starfleet security officers everywhere. You only see like one or two guys, and Iron Stephen Bear really regretted that, saying he wanted to see like tons of them, but they ran out of budget. And also they wanted more of the spaceship battles between the Defiant and the Lakota, but they ran out of budget, so they had to really chop that down to the bare minimum and explain most of it through dialogue, like Worf and Kira being, oh, they're firing on us, oh, they're engineering, and so you barely get any shots of the ship's firing. And the other thing that really I thought was funny is you notice that when Odo breaks Cisco out of prison, he uses the Vulcan nerve pinch, and that always never really made sense to me. Why is Odo using the Vulcan nerve pinch? And apparently they explain, because they ran out of budget for Odo to morph, and they couldn't, because that would be the ideal way for Odo to take people down, by him using his changeling abilities, but they didn't have enough budget to do it, so they just had him do the Vulcan nerve pinch. I still think this is a good episode. I would disagree with Bear that this episode didn't turn out good. I think it's great. I mean, sure, if they actually had the budget to do these things, it would have looked better. It would have looked more cool. But the point of the story is the point of the episode is the story, and I think the story is so strong that it comes across regardless. I mean, sure, it would have been better had they had more money for the special effects, but I think it still really works. So I kind of disagree with him there. Anyway, let me get more into some of the character stories in this episode, or in this two-parter. So we begin the two-parter with the storyline of Dax sneaking into Odo's room when he's regenerating and moving all of his furniture by a couple centimeters, and so he wakes up, he's really pissed off, he yells at Quark, "Quark, you and her are probably in this together," and he's really pissed off. And you can see Jadzia with Cisco, when she sees Odo being all pissed off, she's like, oh, here we go. Like, she's taking delight in this. So, basically, and then they explain later that they kind of try to play it off like a changeling trait, because changelings are all about order. And so everything has to be in perfect order, which is why Odo once, so pissed off if his furniture is moved by like just a couple of centimeters. So it's not really furniture, it's like shape-shifting things. If you've seen his room is like that, but whatever. And the thing is that, so basically what they're saying are changelings are OCD. Obsessive compulsive disorder. And That's interesting because this is what it comes off as: is Odo's being OCD, and Dax is being an asshole to people who are OCD. I mean, that's basically. I mean, if someone's OCD who gets really pissed off if everything's not absolutely perfect, like if you go around and move everything, just that is cruel. That's being an asshole. That's playing to their disorder, and it's kind of like, yeah, it is cruel. And why is Jadzia cruel? I think this scene goes totally against her character. It doesn't fit into her character at all. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, eventually they show her putting everything back in order and Odo sort of getting his revenge. But if she knows that he is this way, I guess it's not really disorder if this is just a trait of his species. But still, if he is this way and she purposely fucks with him just for some sadistic glee, then she's an asshole. And I don't get it. I think it totally goes against their character. But anyway, we get another scene we get a bit later on is where Bashir and O'Brien are in Quark's, and from the Hollow Suites, and they're talking about how it's a funny scene too when they go to smash their shot glasses down on the table, and Quark's like, "Ah, what did I say about throwing glasses around?" So then they like gently set it down. Like, that's a nice touch. The character, just the writing in this episode is really top notch. Just the character interactions, all the subtle moments like this really work and help sell it. But anyway. O'Brien and Bashir are talking about how scared they are and how upset they are because of what's going on Earth, the terrorist attack, and how much they're worried about their home planet. And Quark tries to relate to them, and he talks about how there was a financial crisis on Ferenginar, and he knows exactly how he feels because his accounts were being liquidated, and he felt like his accounts needed him. And then O'Brien was like, "Well, somehow you telling me that doesn't make me feel any better." And then Quark is just like, "Oh, you humans, you only care about yourselves." This is it was interesting because you look at this scene. This is a very antagonistic scene between these characters. Like, Quark is generally pissed off at O'Brien's reaction and think that he's being very insensitive to his needs when he was actually trying to help and trying to relate. Now, I've heard some opinions that O'Brien was being a bit of a dick to Quark because in a recession is a serious, or a depression, a financial crisis is a serious crisis because a lot of people lose their jobs, they lose money, they can no longer sustain themselves, they become homeless, some people could commit suicide, so it's a serious thing. So some people think that O'Brien was making light of a serious issue, but I actually disagree, because if you watch this scene, Quark doesn't frame the crisis in those terms. He doesn't say, "Oh, I feared for my planet because people were losing their jobs. Children weren't able to feed their children. They couldn't feed themselves. People were committing suicide." He didn't say any of that. He didn't even imply any of that. What he did say was, "My account needed me." So he was specifically saying that the problem with the financial crisis was not the effect it had on the people, it was the effect it had on the money. And if you think about it, that is kind of a really Ferengi way of looking at it, that they wouldn't really give a fuck about how it affected the people of society. They would just care about their own personal money and greed. And so that's why O'Brien was like, saying, "Well, that doesn't relate to my issue," and I actually agree with him. I think he was in the right to say that because Quark's trying to relate money issues. Not that he should be. If Quark did bring up the human costs, or Ferengi costs in this case, that economic crashes have, then okay, it would be relatable. But that's not how he framed it. I think you have to look at how Quark framed it in this scene. But anyway, so when we get to Earth and we meet Cisco's father for the first time, Joseph Cisco, And he's an interesting character. I don't know if I quite like. He's played really colloquially as this is the way he's very eccentric, and he reacts to always relates everything to Cajun food or whatever. And I don't know. Like, I think I like the way his character, because he was a very strong. You could tell the writers had a very clear vision of what this character was like, and they did a good job portraying that. But I think we spent too much time on this. I think this does bog down, particularly the first part, a bit too much, and maybe why even though I really love this two-parter, I can't say it's like one of the best of the show, because I do think the pacing is a bit off, and it does kind of lull a bit in this first part, because they focus a bit too much on Joseph Cisco, particularly in this first part about him saying, "Oh, just point me in the direction," like the whole thing about Cisco being worried about his health. I mean, it's an interesting tidbit to add in there, but I think they harp on it for way too long. And yeah, I just think the episode kind of drags a bit. What was really interesting, getting a bit more to the second part, is after Cisco discovers that Latent was behind everything, and this was all an attempted coup. We get this really amazing scene between Cisco and Odo, which I think is absolutely great acting, particularly on Avery Brooks's part. Now, I know I like to trash on his acting a lot, because a lot of times he can just overdo it, but there's some times where he gets it. I don't think he's a bad actor overall, because there's some times where he does get it like just right, and I think this is one of those cases where he does such a good job of portraying what impact this has on Cisco, and how it's destroying his whole worldview, that his own like mentor, former commander, is the one responsible for basically trying to, overthrow the government, to have a military coup, and how this is really destroying his whole worldview, and also, of course, the Changeling threat still looming over everything, and how much of an impact. And I think the scene between Odo and Cisco really helps sell that. And I love the line when Cisco says to him, there's sometimes that I wish you've never met your people, Odo. And he's like, I can understand that. I feel the same way. Which is really powerful. Really good character stuff. Now, there's also the storyline about Nog trying to get into Red Squad, which I'll talk about Red Squad a bit later on. But anyway, I thought it was kind of funny that this future is supposed to be like this perfect paradise future, and yeah, it seems like that even in the future it's all about who you know, because Nog said he needs a recommendation from a superior officer, from a command level officer, in order to get into Red Squad. And commander, he just so happens to know a command level officer in Benjamin Cisco, so since he's friends with his son, he can go to him and be like, "Oh, sponsor me." So it seems like, because this is like an issue in modern times, that a lot of industries and jobs, like, it doesn't matter how good you are at the job, how much potential you have, it's all about who you know, which is a fault. It's a flawed system. It definitely shouldn't be that way, and it seems like they're saying that Starfleet's that way, because if you think back to how Nog got into the academy in the first place, it's because he was sponsored by Cisco. So it's just because he happens to be friends with his son that he gets all these privileges, and maybe there's other people who are more qualified to be in Starfleet than Nog, but they don't happen to know any command officers. But just because he happens to know someone, and Cisco constantly pulls strings for him, it seems it's all about who you know, which is a very flawed system. So again, not a lot good going along with this vision of a perfect future. But anyway, so I do love the scene a lot when Cisco finds out Red Squad is involved in the conspiracy. So he goes to Nog because he was his in. He's the first person to even introduce him to the concept of Red Squad. And so Cisco asked Nog to introduce him to a member of Red Squad so he could find out what's going on. And I love this scene so much, because Nog's like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that. This is, because it will look bad if I can't give anyone's names. And Cisco's just like, no, you are obviously under the mistaken impression that I'm asking a favor. I want a name and I want it now, and that is an order. Understood, Mr. Nog? Like, that was amazing. I love that. I love how Cisco could go instantly from having this sort of friendly, casual banter to be like, actually, no, I'm not being casual. I'm ordering you to give me the name. Like, that was such a great scene. And then, of course, when he actually meets with a member of Red Squad, how he dresses him down. Like, I love this scene. And even though Avery Brooks is a little bit over the top here, I think it really works. It's, you did some sloppy work, some damn sloppy work. Like, that was just a great scene that I took a lot of enjoyment from. So anyway, and the central conflict for the second part anyway is the whole Cisco versus Latent thing, and how he sort of turned on his mentor. And you have those scenes towards the end of the episode, which is just the two of them together. Now, this, I think, where Iron Stephen Barry was saying, oh, it sucks that we ran out of budget because we couldn't have more action scene, couldn't have more security officers. But I actually think it works better. It's almost like a Jaws situation where Jaws ran out of budget to have a shark, so they barely show the shark, but that actually works. The less you see the shark, the better. I think this is a similar situation here, that it's actually more powerful, that they had to they couldn't fall back on this huge special effects heavy fight scenes, that they had to fall back on just Cisco and Latent sitting in a room hashing it out. And this is what makes the episode for me. It's a really powerful interaction between these two characters. And I think the acting is really great in those scenes, and it really drives the central conflict. And I love how Latent, thought of Cisco as his protege. He even said it was the officer that he thought was all the officers he served with, Cisco's the one he thought had the most potential, was the best. So it's so interesting to see those two at odds with each other, and how Latent was totally opposed. And I love how when Cisco finally beats him in the end, that Latent just says, I hope you're right. I hope you're not wrong, to Cisco. And that's just really powerful. And of course, how Cisco ends up triumphing is because of Captain Benton refuses to destroy the Defiant, even when Admiral Latent ordered her to. So it shows, and so this is where it's saying that the Starfleet and Federation still have principles, so it's not completely lost. Now, another little production note that's a bit interesting is that one of the writers in Next Generation Season 1 proposed a story very similar to this, where there was kind of like a civil war almost between in Starfleet, where things were messed up, but Roddenberry absolutely refused that and said that wouldn't happen, so they came up with the episode Conspiracy, which involved aliens. Because that was often when Roddenberry said we can't do conflicts because humans are perfect in the 21st century, the solution was always to bring in aliens, because aliens didn't have to be perfect. So it's fair to say that had Roddenberry been involved in this, he would never let this episode happen. And of course that's true of a lot of Deep Space Nine episodes. But I think it was actually, I don't think it betrays his spirit, because it shows in the end that the Starfleet officers still, even though Admiral Latent ordered them to destroy the Defiant, it was just one admiral who was being a bit power hungry, that they still, when it came down to it, she'd rather betray her mentor rather than to actually kill other Starfleet officers. And I think that is a very good note. It spoke very highly. Alright, so now let me get into some more of the continuity things that relate to the rest of the series. Let me start with the continuity gaffe, which I think is kind of inconsistent. It's a very minor thing, but there's a scene when Nog goes to Cisco's restaurant, where Joseph Cisco apparently finds fresh 2 grubs, so that he goes all the way to New Orleans to have dinner so he could, because it's the only place on Earth where he can find fresh tube grubs. And first of all, I find that really hard to believe. It's quite serendipitous that it just so happens to be Cisco's father who's the only person on the entire planet. And plus, because Joseph Cisco seems so stuck up on New Orleans cuisine that it has to be Creole or Cajun food, and it doesn't seem in his character to sell tube grubs. Anyway, in this scene, Nog's like, "Oh, where are my tube grubs?" And Cisco gets like really disgusted by this. You see him put down his food. He's like, I lost my appetite because Nog's here talking about tube grubs. Whereas Jake is just smiling. He doesn't care. He's like, "Oh, that's just my friend." It doesn't bother him at all. This is very contradicted in a couple seasons later, where Cisco's having dinner with Jake and Nog, and Cisco reveals that he put tube grubs in their food, and Jake spits it out and thinks it's disgusting. It's like, "Ooh, tube grubs!" And Cisco has, Benjamin has no problem eating it. So that completely contradicts what we saw in this scene. Now, you could argue that a couple years have passed and maybe Benjamin's taste has changed, but I don't think that holds any water, because here Jake was the one who had no issue with it, and Benjamin had just the mention of Nog saying tube grub made him lose his appetite. And to go from that to actually actively eating them and not caring, I don't buy it. But anyway, a very minor thing. Anyway, let's talk about Red Squad. Red Squad. One of the worst introductions on Deep Space Nine. But anyway, yeah, I don't know what to say about it. I don't buy it. To me, this is another negative of the two-parter, something that I didn't really care for, that I think they would have been better without. I think the reason why they probably created them is because they wanted to find a way to integrate Nog into the story. And so he's at Starfleet Academy, so they need to find a way for the Academy to somehow be involved in this conspiracy. And so that doesn't really make any sense unless you have a very elite squad that would be seen as just as good as any other Starfleet unit, so that Latent would use them to do this power outage thingy. So I just see their whole invention of this Red Squad thing was just so they could find an excuse to bring Nog into the story, I think. And then of course it brought us the episode The Valiant later in season 6, which I did a review on. You can check that out. I did not like it. I don't like the whole concept of Red Squad. But anyway, let me talk about something that always bothered me about this episode, is that the president of the Federation is not the president of Earth. In this episode, this alien, I can't even remember what his species was, but he was brought in to be Jarish Indio. He's the president of the Federation. He's making decisions on the security of Earth. And Latent would always talk about, oh, this isn't his world. He shouldn't be in charge of security of Earth. But he shouldn't be in charge of security of Earth because he's the president of the Federation. He's not the governor of Earth. It seems like he should be there to govern the Federation, not Earth. And a lot of these issues having to do with the security of Earth, I think should fall under the purview of whoever's. There should be, because it's kind of like you have the president of the United States in Washington, D.C. But he's not in charge of Washington, D.C. He's in charge of the United States, if you get what I'm saying. Like, and let's say, for example, I know Washington, D.C. isn't in Virginia or Maryland, but it borders it, and so Virginia and Maryland have their own governors. And so it seems like if you look at this as a united federation of planets, so it's an entity made up kind of the way the United States is made up of states, United Federation of Planets made up of planets. So you have a president who governs the whole Federation of Planets, so all the planets united together. where each planet should have its individual governor, or whatever you call it, just like every state has its individual governor. So if there was a national security issue with the state, sure, of course the federal government could provide aid, but the primary defense of it, or dealing with it, would be the governor. Of course, the president could step in and make decisions and help out, but it wouldn't be his primary responsibility. The primary responsibility would fall to the governor. And it seems like you could argue, well, this is a military situation, but it seems like so the president would play more of a role in military decisions. But it seems like Jarshinu should only be concerned with the aspect of how it involves the Federation. There's a lot of these scenes between Cisco, Latent, and Enyo where it seems like they're dealing with more specific things that should fall under the purview of whoever's in charge of Earth. Now, apparently, there was originally, Ronald D. Moore apparently originally had thrown in some lines in there to explain this away to, I can't remember, they didn't call him the governor of Earth, I can't remember exactly what they called him, but they mentioned that there was another figure who was in charge directly of Earth, but they didn't show him, they just mentioned him offhand to explain this away, but apparently those lines ended up getting cut because they thought it just bogged the episode down. I think it would have helped, but I don't think it would have been good enough, because I don't think that Latent and Cisco should even be meeting with the president of the Federation. They should be meeting with whoever is specifically charged with the defense of Earth, which should be the governor or whatever they call it of Earth, not the Federation. And so, because a lot of specific things in these scenes where Latent is like, oh, he's not from this world, he shouldn't be in charge of the security, but like, he shouldn't, because he's in charge of the Federation. He shouldn't be worried about one specific planet. I mean, he could be partially involved the way the President of the United States would be, could provide federal aid to a particular state that needs it, but he should be the same way. But anyway, kind of going off on a rant here. It's interesting to note that, and this is totally a retcon, 1000%, but in Season 7 it's revealed that Section 31 infected Odo with a disease that they were hoping he would spread to the Founders, and it was retroactively stated that this was done here at this time when Odo was visiting Starfleet headquarters. And has it said, because Section 31 wasn't even invented yet at this stage. They didn't even come up with the idea of Section 31 until Season 6. So I described it before as kind of a sloppy retcon, because I don't think it really... There's a bit more going on here, but I guess you could say it makes sense since they're terrified of the changelings at the moment. But to infect Odo, hoping that he would spread it to the rest of the changelings, is a bit of a stretch, a bit of a far-fetched hope, and it just so happens that this happened to happen. And the only reason it happened is because Dominion took over Deep Space Nine when Odo was still on board. There's no way they could predict that would happen. But anyway, or you could argue he infected them when they took him to the Founder homeworld and put him in a length and turned him into a human. But then the whole thing gets confusing. I think it was just a bit of a retcon. Anyway, let me talk a bit more about the Dominion story arc. So, we get this one scene where Changeling is like impersonating Admiral Latent, and Odo like goes to shake his hand, and he's being a big asshole to Odo. He's like, oh, you suck at changing. And so Odo can tell something's wrong, so he shakes his hand and reveals it's a Changeling. And so when I first saw the scene, I got the impression, a lot of people got this impression, they assumed that the Changeling, the Admiral Latent was a Changeling this whole time, and that the real Admiral Latent was dead. Because that has been established to be the Changeling's MO. Even before and after this episode, that when they take over someone, they completely take over their lives. They kill the actual person or throw them in prison, as in the case with Martok, because they wanted to keep that character around. Or the case with the dude ambassador from the adversary, I think it was heavily implied that they killed him. And had a Changeling take over. So it doesn't really make sense to me. Why would a Changeling take over Latent, but the real Admiral Latent's perfectly fine? What if the real Admiral Latent came in, and how would they explain Admiral Latent being in two different places at the same time? Like, there's a lot of flaws with this. It doesn't make sense to me. Why? I mean, they said Odo talked about how it would make sense they would personate Latent since he was in charge of the security, but why wouldn't they take over Latent permanently? Why just do this temporary thing where Odo can just find out who he is? And plus, like, it seems like the Changelings have been able, like the ambassador from the adversary or Martok, that they do a better job at impersonating the subject they're impersonating. Where here, him being a dick to Odo like this and saying, "Oh, you suck at shapeshifting," is totally out of character for Latent. So this whole thing, it seems like it was just there to remind people Changelings who are threatened to show Odo being cool, but it seems completely out of character for how the Changelings are shown to behave. But anyway, let me talk about O'Brien Changeling, because this I actually think fits with the Changelings' MO a lot more, even though they don't kill O'Brien completely, take him over, but that wasn't the point. The point of the scene where, with the Changeling impersonating O'Brien goes up and talks to Cisco and tells him about the havoc that they wrought. First of all, like, why would he do this? It seems like he's just helping Cisco. I guess it's meant to be that they're taunting them and showing how fucked they are, because there's only 4 Changelings on Earth, and that they're managing to instill so much fear. But it seems like the main drive of that scene was to make Cisco realize that the biggest issue was their own fear and how they react to it, rather than the Changelings themselves, that they were helping them win, which is a very powerful commentary for terrorism in general, but I'll get to that a bit later on. But it doesn't seem like that was very smart of that Changeling. It doesn't seem like the Changeling had a purpose to go to Cisco, other than to gloat. And it seems like they were smarter than just gloating, because what they actually ended up doing is motivating Cisco to worry less about them and more about how they reacted to it. So in a way, he was actually helping Cisco, which doesn't seem like they want to do. But and it seems like the real reason, of course, the Changeling was impersonating O'Brien was because they wanted the actor to, because they had no budget to hire a guest star, so they just used the actor they had, basically. But Colmany does do a really great job playing this Changeling. I did think this was a nice scene, though. And I think the way he played the Changeling was a lot more realistic. The way he was all chipper, like, "Oh, why don't we go to the bar, have a pint?" Because that shows that the Changelings are very good at impersonating people, that they knew specific character traits like that, and he was able to act so like O'Brien, but actually accentuate that in a way, and the whole time he is acting like O'Brien. So to me, this is more in keeping than that time that they impersonated Latent. He was totally out of character. So it is interesting to think about when you put this episode in the larger context of the show, of what the shapeshifters do, because it seems like they could have, they almost brought the Federation to the brink of civil war just by scaring some people. It seems like if they kept it up, they could have caused a lot more havoc. And at the end of the episode, Joseph talked about how he was afraid of the Changelings and what they could do in the future, but in the future they end up doing basically nothing, not on Earth anyway. And this is something I thought was severely lacking from the Dominion War story arc in season 6 and 7, is that I mean, I suppose you could explain that when Cisco mined the wormhole that all the changelings were in the Gamma Quadrant, but why? And it was just the leader who was the female changeling was the only one, because she's the only changeling we ever see after the minefield goes up. So you could just say that, and that's why the changelings weren't trying to fuck with Earth at the same time the war was happening. But why weren't there more changelings in the Alpha Quadrant? If they were, they should have been in the midst of interfering and fucking things up when the minefield went up. I don't know. You could always throw some excuse about there being like a holiday or something. All the changelings had to return to home to be with their families. I don't know. But anyway, it is interesting to put this in the greater context of the show, because first we get the adversary, which shows changelings impersonating a Federation ambassador to try to start a war. And then we get this episode that has a terrorist attack, the changelings, and they're trying to tear up Starfleet from the inside. And then, of course, it's implied that they created a conflict between the Federation and the Klingons because they impersonated Martok and got him to push for war and to fuck up the relations of the Klingons. And then you also get later on a changeling impersonating Bashir and going to trying to plant a bomb to blow up a supernova that will destroy Bajor and the station and all of like a Federation, combined Federation, Romulan and Klingon fleet. But it seems like they should, that it stops there, as I said. And you could use the excuse of, oh, none of the changelings were in the Alpha Quadrant when the minefield went up. I don't know. That's a thin excuse, in my opinion. And it just seemed like that the changelings should have done more. Anyway, I did like how Admiral Latent framed Cisco as a changeling as a way to get Cisco out of the way. That was really interesting. And it also the line where Joseph Cisco says there's no test that a smart man hasn't found their way around. So what he was saying when Benjamin was trying to convince him to do blood screenings, and this is a major run like throughout season 4 because it was established in the adversary that changelings can't bleed. So like Martok was constantly cutting himself to prove that he wasn't a changeling, and they did blood screenings on the Cardassian dissidents where they rescued them to prove they weren't changelings, and they're talking about doing blood screenings to everyone here as a precaution. But Joseph says that if he was a really smart changeling, he would find some poor soul, take all of his blood, and then put it out on cue whenever someone like him asks for it. And it does seem like that is exactly what happened, because we see Martok constantly cut himself and bleed, but we know that from later on he's a changeling, of course. Real reason for this is because they didn't know he was a changeling until a year later when they wrote that script. But retroactively, you could say in the universe that this Martok changeling did exactly that. And so it is, blood screens are eventually not really brought up later because I think it's proven that they're unreliable, that the changelings simply found a way around this. And another example is when in Purgatory's Shadow and by Inferno's Light, when the changelings impersonating Bashir, as soon as they realize there's a changeling infiltrator, Bashir says, "Oh, we're gonna have to do another round of blood screening," because he knows that is bullshit. You could say that he's the one administrating the blood screening, so he could just fake it. But I don't think so, because I think it's safe to assume that someone else would be in charge of screening Bashir, that they wouldn't let him do it himself, for the exact reason that if he's a changeling, he could just fake it. So I think that changelings just simply found a way around the blood screenings, and that they were totally ineffective and meaningless, and that's why they stopped doing them. Now, another important question to ask is this episode a cop-out? Particularly the second part. Is the second part a cop-out? Because when I first as I alluded to earlier, when I first saw this two-parter, when the very first time it aired on television, I didn't like it because the part one had sold this as a Changeling infiltration story that was going to deal solely with the Changelings infiltrating Earth and how they're going to try to fuck things up. And this is a story I've been waiting for because I loved The Adversary, the season 3 finale, and I thought the creepiness aspect of Odo saying it's too late, they're everywhere was a really great cliffhanger. Even though I was saying it's not a cliffhanger, it wasn't really a cliffhanger, but it was a really great moment that really intrigued me, and it's something I wanted to see followed up on. And so I didn't like the fact that they totally switched gears to go to this Klingon thing. They did switch gears. Don't try to tell me it's tied in because that wasn't even revealed until season 5, so don't give me that nonsense. It was a totally change in gears to focus on this Klingon stuff, which I didn't like. So I liked how when I heard they were going back to the story, I was like, yes, we're finally getting the follow-up from the season 3 finale that I always wanted. But then we get part 2 of this episode, and they reveal it's not really about that. It's actually about the Starfleet tearing itself up. And so I didn't like it. At first, when this two-part first aired, I would say it's not very good because I was so disappointed that I felt like the first part was totally setting up this Changeling infiltration storyline. The second part completely undermines that and makes it totally about something else. Now, but it should just to be clear, and you should be able to tell from the way I'm talking about this episode that I no longer feel that way, that I have completely come around on that, and I actually do appreciate what they did with the second part much better. And I think actually it's better than simply doing a Changeling infiltration story because it's able to tell a lot of social commentary, which I'll get to shortly, and a much more personalized, human, Star Trek-like story, if you will, than a simple Changeling infiltration would have done. But I think I was thrown off because that's not what I was expecting. That's not what I was sold. And apparently that was the intention of the writers when writing this episode, that they purposely wanted to mislead people and throw people off and misdirect to make them think that. So they purposely made the first part all about Changeling infiltration, and then in the second part they threw it out and made it about like people letting their fear overcome them and doing more damage than the actual terrorists do. And they said the reason why they wanted to do this is because they wanted the audience to be on Latent's side. They wanted the audience to see things from Latent and Cisco's perspective and to totally be on board with, yes, we need these security measures. Joseph, Cisco, you're being an asshole by not giving your blood. Give your damn blood. How can you not do this? We need security. We're going to all die. And then reveal that mentality is actually flawed. So they were kind of playing a trick on the audience, so they would have to be forced to re-examine their own beliefs, where they were totally on board with these security measures and realized that it was just a power-hungry asshole who was letting his fear control him, who wanted to use it as an excuse to grab power. So that's actually very clever. I think I still am on the fence, even though I love this two-parter now, because I do appreciate what they're going for a lot more. I'm still on the fence a bit on whether or not that was the right way to do it, because I do appreciate that it makes the audience re-examine their own beliefs or what they thought was the right way. But is this episode still a cop-out? I can't answer that definitively. I will say it doesn't bother me as much anymore because ultimately I loved what they did with it. But I can understand why I didn't like it the first time I saw it, because they were building it up to be something I really wanted to see, but it wasn't. It was actually something totally different. So it was kind of a cop-out that part 2 went in a completely different direction than what part 1 would indicate it is. So I can't add. I'll leave that question to you. Is this episode a cop-out? Anyway, let me finally get into the social commentary, which is usually when I talk about this two-parters what I accentuate, what I focus on, because this is what I love the most about it, particularly in retrospect. Seeing it a decade later after 9/11. Because it's funny, and I've heard this opinion, and I totally agree, that if this two-parter came out after 9/11, it would be seen as too on-the-nose commentary on the 9/11. In fact, I would argue that had this episode been proposed after 9/11, especially shortly after 9/11 happened, it would never got greenlit. That the studio would have shot it down, saying it's too controversial, it's too touching on too sensitive of an issue, and it's too on the nose. So it's so interesting that actually something that's so relevant, and I remember watching this too, but this is when I really learned to appreciate it, because I was very political active in the early 2000s, around 2004 or 5, around the time of the Iraq War. And as you may be able to tell, I'm a bit of a liberal. I was very much against the war. I was very much against the fear-mongering over terrorism that resulted after 9/11. And so that's when I really learned to appreciate this two-parter, because it became a lot more relevant to modern society than it even was when it aired. Now, apparently, but the fact that this came out a decade before, nearly a decade, it was like 6 years or something, but nearly a decade before, does sort of indicate that this is a recurring theme throughout history, that they were basing this off of earlier historic events and not... And so the fact that it became more relevant just a few years later shows how history often repeats itself, and this is a very common occurrence. This was based off a classic movie. I remember I read what it was. I can't remember at the moment, but a lot of, apparently, like Ira Stephen Bear was very inspired by classic movies for a lot at Deep Space Nine. And I'm not that familiar with classic movies, so a lot of times I don't catch the reference, and it still feels fresh to me. But this is based off of another thing where people were trying to use fear-mongering to basically create like a coup or whatever. And so to say how it relates to 9/11 is basically about the fear-mongering that was involved after that happened, how people in power used it as an excuse to gain more power. The Iraq War is a good example, because they tied it into the Iraq War when the Iraq War had absolutely nothing to do. Iraq had nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11, but have you seen like movies like Vice or any documentary or that talked about the feel of the Dick Cheney White House, or Bush, puppet Bush, but mainly Dick Cheney White House, that immediately after 9/11, they were all the talking heads and all the points tried to find ways, how can we tie this into Iraq? Because it was always their agenda to want to go to Iraq. But anyway, I'm going off on that, on political things. And so basically what I'm saying is that and if you were in America around in the 2000s after 9/11 happened, it was a very strong integrated part of the culture of fear. And they had like Amber Alerts or Red Alert, what do they call it? They didn't have a Red Alert. They had like Amber Alerts. It was code green, code red. And I remember like Michael Moore, who I was really into at the time, used to make fun of this and have like, oh, this is a purple pink alert. And I totally agree with him. Those alerts were probably complete and utter BS, and the whole purpose that they served was to keep Americans afraid, because the more afraid they were, the more civil liberties they would give up, the more power they would give to the powerful, the more they would support the power and doing whatever wars they wanted to fight. And the whole thing with the Patriot Act, where people were willing to give up a lot of civil liberties because of fear. And this to me is exemplified the most in the storyline with Joseph Cisco, and how he did not want to give up his blood. And so he was saying, I have rights, Benjamin. And it's just, that one scene in particular to me is the most like, how could this possibly come out before 9/11? Because that's almost like right on the nose of this whole Patriot Act bullshit, is that he was totally that they were trying to use fear to strip him away. But what was the best part of the storyline is in the next episode, which the next part 2 starts like a couple months later. At the very start of the episode, Joseph is just happily giving his blood. No argument, no nothing. And Jake even notes, like, wow, it's amazing that you don't even care. He's like, well, yeah, but now there's, like, a huge changeling threat and we're all about to die, so now I'm going to do my part. That shows, like, point blank how they use fear to control people. How fear can let you give up your rights and your civil liberties. And I love how the two-parter ends with, like, no one seeming to care about the changelings anymore. And Odo even asked him, it's like, well, aren't you guys still afraid? The changeling threat is still there. We didn't make it go away. And Joseph's like, yeah, I'm terrified, but I'm not going to let that interfere with how I live my life. And that is the takeaway, that you can acknowledge this fear is the threat, but if you let it control your lives, and if you allow people to manipulate you with that fear, to giving up your own rights, then that's the way of letting the terrorists win. Just like, that's why I love that scene where the O'Brien changeling comes up to Cisco and, like, there's only 4 of us here, and you guys are doing all the work for us. You're destroying your own lives, which is what I would often say in the 2000s about how, because George Bush would often say, oh, they hate us because of our freedoms. And I guess, okay, so his solution to that is to take away our freedoms, so then that way they won't hate us anymore. Because that's basically, they're letting the terrorists win by allowing this authoritarian dictatorship to take over and take away our freedoms. Well, okay, it's a bit far-fetched to call Bush an authoritarian dictatorship, particularly considering the kind of president we have now. But because there's safeguards in place and the American system prevented dictatorship, but it was, and I should have said Cheney, not Bush, but anyway, it was close. Like, there was a lot of civil liberties, a lot of rights that were being totally stripped away. And people, like, this really hit me because I was living on the West Coast of the United States when 9/11 happened, and I moved back to visit my parents like a couple years later in like 2004, I think. Yeah, 2003. And as soon as I moved, I was driving through Washington, D.C. On the highway, and there was a sign on the highway that said, report suspicious activity. And I was really struck, and I told my parents about it, and they see it all the time because they live in the area, and they're just like, oh yeah, we see that all the time, it's just normal. But that was so Orwellian to me. That was so, like, Hitler Youth-ish, that report suspicious activity. That sign serves no purpose except to keep you on edge, to keep you afraid, and to keep you looking at your neighbors and wondering, especially if they're brown, wondering, ooh, could this be a bad person? Could I, let me be suspicious. It's fear-mongering at its worst, and it was really disturbing to me that this was normalized for people who lived in this area. That it's just blown away, and I think this is exactly the kind of thing that this episode was cautioning against. And I think, as I said, the storyline with Joseph Cisco really ran this home about how he was totally willing to give up his rights because he was afraid. And I love the character evolution of Benjamin Cisco, because he, like the audience, was totally on board with Latent and totally like, this is a huge threat, we need to do whatever we can to stop it. But then when he realized it was all about Latent using this as an excuse to grab power and to control people through fear, that he realized that, yeah, we should still be afraid. Yes, we should still be cautious, but we shouldn't let this control us. We shouldn't let someone who's power hungry use this as an excuse to control people. Now, let me also talk, even though, this episode came out, as I said, almost a decade before 9/11, some people could say, if they put it if they input it into the context of 9/11, they could say this is a pro 9/11 truther or 9/11 conspiracy thing, because the power outage was actually orchestrated by Latent. So they could say, oh, this is saying that 9/11 was an inside job. But I disagree with that interpretation. Even obviously, it's not what the writers were going for, because this is before 9/11 even happened. But yeah, even if it weren't, and it wouldn't, I don't think it would fit into that dynamic, because the actual terrorist attack with the bomb Changeling set up on the conference, in the Federation Romulan conference, that actually happened. So there is actually a threat. So I would totally reject any notion of anyone trying to say that this has a truther slant to it. It totally does not. In fact, that's kind of the whole point of the episode. It's saying that the threat is real. Just like in real life, the threat of terrorism was real. 9/11 proved that. But it's also cautioning of not letting yourselves give in to the fear of this real threat. Otherwise, you let the terrorists win. Yeah, and that's again, that's exemplified at the end of the episode, which I love the ending of this episode, where Joseph says, yes, I'm still scared, but I'm not going to give in to my fears. Anyway, this has been a much longer than I intended to review, so if you stick to this, thank you so much. So I'll give my rating for Homefront and Paradise Lost out of 10 as a 9 excellent. Now, when this episode first came out, I'd probably give it like a 6 or 7. In the early 2000s or late 2000s, I would probably give this episode a 10. Nowadays, I had to sort of temper it between, because I love, obviously, I love the social commentary and how relevant it became a decade after it even aired. And just the character stories, as I described, I think were really well portrayed. As I said, this episode was really well written. So I am tempted to give it a 10. But I do have to take into account that it does drastically switch direction from part 1 to part 2. And even though I kind of get why, it does seem like a bit of a cop-out. It doesn't make me question that. And then there's also a lot of the Red Squad storyline and the stuff with Joseph Cisco being sick. Like, as I said, the first part does drag a bit because of this stuff. So I think it is a bit bloated. So for those reasons, I can't quite give it a 10. But I will give it a 9. And I do think, and this was I believe this was in my top 20 when I did my top 20 best Deep Space Nine episodes. So I do think that highly of it. So anyway, that is it for my review of Homefront and Paradise Lost. This was a Patreon selected video, so thank you once again for everyone who supports my channel through Patreon. And if you would like to support me on Patreon, it'd be very much appreciated. If you do even $1 a month or more, you get access to polls like these. You get access to a Patreon-only video series, which I'm doing, where I do reviews for Star Trek the Animated Series. You also have, I send out an email with my schedule of what videos I'll be making in the coming months. And sometimes I'll release certain videos, do a pre-release exclusively for Patreon supporters. And if you want to support the channel $5 or more, you'll gain access to, you'll be able to, if you would like, if you have something to say about a Star Trek episode I'm about to review, you can send me your commentary on the episode and I will read it on my review. And if you support the channel $10 or more, which is very much appreciated, then you can request a video for me to do whatever you'd like me to do, and I'll do it. Anyway, if you want to support the channel through Patreon, there's the link in the description below. Anyway, I will be back next week. Hopefully this Star Trek episode review will be a weekly feature on my channel from now on. There are other polls which anyone can vote on, which I'll be covering in the coming weeks. And you can go to my channel. I have a video out where it's Star Trek episode polls, where you can vote for what episode you'd like me to review next. There's currently 4 polls up that are still ongoing that you can vote in. Anyway, be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek episode reviews and many more reviews on other shows like The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.